The princess was born on a cold, silver morning in the heart of the empire. Her people had lived among the stars for centuries, and their voices were strong, clear, and full of power. Every ruler, every heir had always spoken with authority. But the princess, she did not speak. Not a word. No cries, no sounds, no voice at all. Her parents, the emperor and empress, watched quietly as she lay in her cradle, small hands reaching for the air but never making a sound. From the first day the court whispered. "The silent princess," they said. "How can she rule if she cannot speak?" Her silence was not from fear or illness. She was healthy and bright, but her voice simply did not exist. The empire had no guide for this, no rule to follow. Tutors were summoned, one after another, each promising to unlock her voice, each certain their methods would succeed. The first tutor was a tall man with robes of blue and silver. He spoke many languages and claimed he could teach the princess to speak using sound waves. But no matter what he tried, she remained quiet. She listened, nodded, and sometimes tilted her head as if she understood more than anyone imagined, but she never made a sound. Next came a woman who taught with gestures and signs. She moved her hands gracefully, drawing invisible patterns in the air. She tried to make the princess copy the motions, hoping that words would follow. The princess copied some gestures, but her lips did not move and her voice did not come. Over the years more tutors arrived. Some were scholars of the mind, others experts in music, language, or the art of speech. 50 tutors in all tried and failed. Some left in frustration. Some gave up quietly. The princess's world became full of lessons that never worked, of attempts that never bore fruit. Yet she watched. She observed the world around her carefully. She understood things without needing to speak. Her eyes were sharp and her mind was quick. She learned to read the expressions of others, to notice small changes in tone, to understand meaning without words. The palace itself was enormous. Towers stretched into the sky, halls shimmered with crystal lights and gardens floated above the clouds. Yet in all this beauty the princess often felt lonely. The other children of the court could run and laugh, could call out and be heard. She could only watch. She noticed how her parents tried to hide their worry, how the emperor would sometimes sigh behind closed doors, and how the empress would hold the princess's hand, hoping she understood love even without words. The tutors' failures became a quiet secret of the court. Nobody wanted to speak of it too loudly. To admit that a princess could not speak was almost like admitting the empire had made a mistake. Some began to wonder if she would ever grow into a leader. Some even suggested she should not rule at all. But the princess did not care about their doubts. She cared about the small things, the way the sun reflected on the crystal floors, the sound of water in the palace fountains, the touch of a soft cloak around her shoulders. She learned to communicate without words, using looks, gestures, and expression. She had her own way of understanding the world. Despite the failures, the tutors never really understood her. They tried to make her fit into their rules, into their ideas of how a princess should speak. But she was different. And perhaps the court thought different meant weak. Yet there was a quiet strength in her. She could see things others missed. She could notice a smile before it fully formed, a sadness before it was spoken. Her silence was not emptiness. It was observation, patience, and understanding. The palace staff and servants often felt sorry for her. They whispered in the corridors about how sad it was that no one could reach her, how strange it was that a princess could be so alone in a crowded palace. But they did not know the princess's mind. She was never truly alone. She had her thoughts, her dreams, her curiosity. And she watched. She noticed everything. Every movement, every sound, every shift in the atmosphere. One evening, as the silver sun dipped below the floating gardens, the princess sat in the grand hall. She watched the tutors leave for the night, each carrying another failure in their pride. She reached out her hand and traced patterns on the polished floor. She did not speak, yet she felt a spark of hope. Perhaps, she thought, there was someone who could see her not as a failure, but as she really was. The court had given up hope, the tutors had failed, and the empire whispered doubts. But the princess did not lose hope. Deep in her heart, she waited. She waited for someone who would understand her, someone who could reach her in a way that 50 tutors never could. And so, the silent heir of the empire continued her life quietly, observing, learning, and waiting. The palace was large, the empire vast, and the world full of sound and words she could not use, but she had something no tutor could give her: patience, understanding, and the quiet strength of a mind that could see without speaking. Far below the grand halls of the palace, in the quiet corridors no one noticed, worked a human janitor. He had come from a distant planet called Earth, a small world among billions in the galaxy. Humans were rare in this empire. They were valued for their hands and their strength but not for their minds. They were often ignored, thought too simple to understand the ways of the stars. The janitor, however, was curious. He liked to watch. He saw the princess often, though she did not speak. She moved silently through the halls, her eyes wide, watching everything. Most of the palace ignored her. The tutors ignored her. But the janitor did not. He noticed the way she looked at the light, how she watched the gardens from the floating windows, how her fingers traced the edges of tables and railings. She was quiet, yes, but she was not empty. She was full of thought, full of life. One afternoon, the janitor was cleaning the grand library, polishing the tall shelves, when he noticed the princess sitting on a bench, staring at a stack of books she could not read aloud. Her lips moved slightly as if trying to form words, but nothing came out. The janitor paused and watched her for a long moment. Unlike the tutors, he did not see failure. He saw curiosity, patience, and a mind that wanted to reach out but could not. He thought about how human children often learn. Before they speak, they play. They use their hands, their eyes, their movements to show what they mean. Perhaps the princess could understand in a way the tutors had not tried. Perhaps she needed something simple, something alive, something playful. He smiled quietly and went back to his work, but the idea stayed in his mind. The palace was full of rules. Humans were not allowed in many rooms, not allowed near the royal family, not allowed to teach. But the janitor did not care. He was small, unnoticed, and the princess was invisible to most of the court. One evening, after the tutors had left and the palace was quiet, he found himself alone in the hall with her. He knelt on the floor and removed his gloves. Then, using his fingers, he made small puppet shapes. He moved them slowly, first waving, then dancing, then pretending they spoke to each other. The princess blinked. She tilted her head. For the first time in years, someone was not trying to make her speak. Someone was simply showing her something fun, something alive. Her eyes followed the puppets carefully. She reached out her hand not to speak but to touch, to move, to interact. Her fingers brushed the janitor's puppet and she smiled, small and quiet but very real. From that day on, the janitor visited often. He made new puppets from rags, cloth, and old gloves. He created little stories, silent stories with actions, gestures, and motions. He never spoke to her about lessons or rules. He only played. And the princess responded. She learned to move the puppets herself, to show her thoughts and feelings with them. She laughed quietly when a puppet fell over, frowned when another disappeared, and sometimes made up her own tiny stories that surprised him. No tutor had ever seen her laugh. No tutor had ever seen her try to create. They had tried to make her fit into their strict rules, to force her voice to appear. But she did not need their rules. She needed someone who could see her as she was. And the janitor did. Over weeks, their bond grew stronger. The palace staff whispered about the janitor spending too much time near the princess, but no one really noticed what he was doing. It was just play after all, nothing official. The tutors remained proud, thinking that no human could teach a princess anything. They had no idea. The princess began to show small signs of understanding without speaking. She pointed to things, made gestures, and moved the puppets to tell her thoughts. The janitor learned to read her movements and she learned to trust him. It was a language of motion and feeling, a language no tutor had thought to teach. The palace at night was quiet, the corridors empty, the lights dim. But in one hall, the silent princess and the unnoticed human janitor created a world of stories. Each puppet, each gesture, each small motion was a bridge between two beings who saw the world differently but could understand each other perfectly. The empire may have ignored the janitor. The tutors may have failed the princess. But in that quiet hall, a new connection was forming. One built not on authority, not on rules, but on patience, creativity, and human kindness. The silent princess was no longer alone. She had someone who understood her, someone who could reach her in a way no one else had ever imagined. And though the palace would not notice, and though the tutors would never understand, a small revolution had begun, quiet, simple, and human. The princess had found a friend. The janitor had found a purpose. And together they were about to show the empire that voice is not always spoken. The janitor had never considered himself a teacher. He cleaned floors, polished glass, and organized supplies. But now, in the quiet palace hall, he found himself inventing lessons without realizing it. The puppets were small, made from gloves and scraps of cloth, but they could move, dance, and even speak, in their tiny way. The princess watched them carefully, her eyes wide with curiosity. She had never seen anyone use play in this way. At first, the other staff who passed the hall laughed quietly when they saw the puppets. "What is he doing now?" they whispered. Playing games with the silent princess? Ridiculous. Even the palace guards shook their heads. A janitor teaching a princess? It sounded impossible, even silly. But the janitor did not care. He only cared that the princess was smiling, that her eyes were bright, that she was responding in a way no tutor had ever seen. He began making little stories with the puppets. One would fall and the other would help it up. One would hide and the other would search. He used gestures, motion, and careful timing. He did not speak. He only moved the puppets and waited. Slowly the princess started to copy him. At first she mimicked simple movements. Then she began creating her own puppet gestures, showing ideas that surprised him. The janitor realized something remarkable. The princess understood more than anyone had believed. She did not need words. She did not need the complicated machines, the lessons, or the tutor's rules. She only needed someone to see her differently, to communicate in a way she could reach. With the puppets she expressed joy, curiosity, and even small frustrations. She began to laugh quietly when a puppet fell, or tilted its head in a funny way. She frowned when one disappeared from her hand. She was alive in ways the tutors had never noticed. Word of the janitor's strange lessons spread slowly. Servants whispered in the corridors and a few of the guards peeked in when they could. Some shook their heads at the sight of a human making stories with simple puppets. Ridiculous, they said quietly. It cannot help the princess. And yet they could not deny what they saw. Her eyes were alive. She was moving, interacting, and learning. Something was happening and it was nothing like the tutors had tried. The janitor and the princess developed a silent routine. Each evening when the palace grew quiet, they met in the same hall. The janitor made puppets and the princess moved them in her own way. Sometimes she would point to an idea and he would follow. Sometimes she would act out a story alone and he would watch carefully. Slowly they built a language of motion. One gesture could mean happiness. One tilt of a puppet could mean curiosity. One tiny movement could show a question. The tutors remained unaware. They continued their methods, insisting that she could be taught with sound, voice, or complicated devices. But the janitor knew differently. The princess was learning. She was communicating in her own way. And each day her confidence grew. She began to make decisions in the puppet stories, showing initiative. She laughed, she frowned, she created. She was no longer the quiet, passive child the tutors had given up on. The palace itself seemed to change. Even the guards and staff who had once ignored her now noticed her movement, her energy, her connection with the janitor. They began to whisper differently. She smiles, they said. She moves her hands like she understands. No one knew exactly what had changed, only that the princess seemed more alive than ever before. The janitor felt a quiet pride, though he never boasted. He did not teach with authority. He did not demand obedience or attention. He simply played. And through play he had reached her. Through motion, patience, and imagination, he had unlocked a door no one else could open. The puppets were small, silly, and simple, but they were powerful. They allowed the princess to show the world that silence did not mean emptiness. One evening, after a long session, the janitor looked at her and smiled. She had created a story with the puppets entirely on her own. She moved them carefully, showing a small adventure where one puppet helped another cross a river of light. She tilted her head at him, waiting for him to respond, and he nodded quietly, moving his own puppet in agreement. The palace may have thought it ridiculous. The tutors may have believed they were the only ones who could teach her. But the janitor and the princess had discovered something no one else could see. Understanding does not always need words. Connection does not always need authority. And sometimes the smallest, simplest act, like moving a puppet across a floor, can change everything. And so the silent princess continued to learn, to laugh, and to explore her new language. And the janitor continued to invent stories, to move puppets, to watch her grow. Neither noticed the hours passing, nor cared about the palace rules. They only knew one truth. For the first time in her life, the princess could reach out and someone could reach back. One morning, a group of royal observers entered the hall unexpectedly. The janitor and the princess had been practicing with the puppets as usual. She was moving them quickly now, telling a story of a small creature helping another cross a glowing bridge. The janitor watched her carefully, guiding her movements when needed. He did not speak and she did not need to. Their language of motion had grown strong and clear. The observers were shocked. They had been sent to check on the princess to see if she was learning anything at all. What they saw instead was astonishing. The princess was moving the puppets with skill and imagination. She showed emotion, decision-making, and understanding without a single word. Her eyes shone brightly, full of life and awareness. The observers whispered to each other, their faces pale. None of the 50 tutors had achieved this. The janitor froze, worried. He knew the rules. Humans were not supposed to teach princesses. Tutors were supposed to control her learning. He feared the observers would be angry. But the princess did not stop. She continued her puppet story, tilting, moving, and creating. It was clear she understood every gesture, every motion, and every idea. One of the senior tutors, who had been visiting the hall at the same time, stepped forward. "What is happening here?" he demanded. His voice was loud and sharp. He looked at the janitor with disbelief. A human teaching a princess? Using puppets. The janitor swallowed. He did not answer. He only moved the puppets slowly, showing the story again. The princess copied him perfectly, showing the scene exactly as he intended. Then for the first time she did something new. She made a puppet fall, and another puppet reached out to help it. She tilted her head toward the observers as if to ask, "Do you understand?" The tutors and observers stared. No one could believe what they saw. The princess was learning, expressing herself, and communicating. She was not silent in the way they had thought. She was silent in her voice, yes, but full of expression, intelligence, and creativity. The janitor had found a way to reach her that no one else had imagined. The head tutor stepped closer, examining the movements carefully. This is remarkable," he said quietly. "She is showing understanding, thought, and problem-solving. All without words. How is this possible?" The janitor shook his head. "She does not need words," he said simply. "She sees. She feels. She understands. She just needs someone to play with her in a way she can understand." The observers and tutors could not deny the truth. The princess was learning. She was communicating. She was alive in a way no technology, no language device, no expert tutor had ever reached. Slowly their disbelief turned to amazement. They began to watch more carefully, noticing the small gestures, the thoughtful pauses, the tiny signs of reasoning. Some of the tutors began to whisper among themselves. "Perhaps we were wrong," one said. "Perhaps the way we taught her was too rigid." Another added, "We focused on words, sounds, and rules. We did not see her mind." The human janitor, quiet and humble, continued to guide the princess, showing patience and kindness. He did not argue, he did not demand respect. He simply played, and the results spoke louder than any words. The princess, sensing approval from the observers, moved the puppets faster now. She showed more complex stories, a puppet traveling across a field, helping another find a lost treasure, overcoming obstacles. Each action showed understanding, planning, and creativity. The observers could not hide their amazement. They whispered to each other, unsure how to report this to the emperor and empress. By the end of the day, the court realized a truth they had ignored for too long. The princess was not broken. She was not weak. She simply communicated in a different way. Her silence was not failure, it was a new form of intelligence. And the janitor, the human no one had noticed, had discovered it. The observers left quietly, filled with wonder and respect. They spoke to the tutors, who nodded slowly, realizing their pride had blinded them. The janitor returned to his cleaning quietly, as if nothing had happened. The princess, however, knew something had changed. The world had finally seen her. The empire had finally realized that words are not the only way to communicate. That evening, the janitor and the princess sat together as before. But now the palace seemed different. The halls were the same, the windows still glowed with silver light, but the air felt lighter. The court had noticed, and a new respect for her had begun to grow. The silent princess, once ignored, was no longer invisible. She had a voice without words, and the empire had begun to understand it. For the first time, the janitor smiled without worry. Their quiet lessons had not only taught the princess, they had taught the court something important. Patience, play, and understanding could reach places that rules and authority never could. And the empire, vast and proud, had learned to watch and listen in a new way. The silent princess had changed. No longer ignored, no longer unseen, she moved through the palace with quiet confidence. Her eyes sparkled with understanding, and her gestures carried meaning. The empire had watched her, studied her, and finally realized something remarkable. Silence did not mean weakness. The princess's mind was sharp, her thoughts clear, and her heart full of wisdom. The janitor continued his work in the palace, cleaning floors, polishing glass, and organizing supplies. But now his presence had a new meaning. He was not just a human worker. He was the one who had discovered a way to reach the princess, a way that no tutor, no device, no expert could. He had never demanded respect or praise. He had only played, used imagination, and been patient. And through his simple kindness, he had changed the future of the Empire. The princess had learned to communicate in a way the Empire could understand. The puppets, the gestures, the movements, they were more than toys. They were her voice. She could tell stories, express feelings, and even give instructions without speaking a single word. The court, once skeptical, now watched her carefully. The tutors, once proud, now took notes. They realized that true understanding did not always come from authority or strict methods. Sometimes it came from play, patience, and trust. One day the emperor called for a meeting in the grand hall. The princess entered, her eyes bright, her hands moving gracefully. The court gathered, curious and cautious. The tutors whispered to each other, unsure what the emperor expected. Then the princess began her demonstration. She moved the puppets, creating a story of a small creature traveling across mountains to help others in need. Each movement was precise, each gesture full of meaning. She showed courage, planning, and care in ways words could never capture. The emperor watched silently, amazed. The empress's eyes filled with tears of joy. The tutors nodded slowly, finally understanding that the princess's silence was not a flaw but a gift. She had a voice, yes, but it was a voice without sound. It reached minds, hearts, and souls in a way no spoken language could. The janitor stood at the back of the hall, quietly observing. He did not move to the front. He did not take credit. But the princess's gestures found him in the crowd, and she smiled. It was a small smile, but it carried meaning. Thank you. He had believed in her when no one else had. He had played, imagined, and shown patience. And now the Empire would never forget. The court began to adopt the new method. Tutors learned to teach without demanding words. They watched for gestures, expressions, and creativity. They realized that intelligence could take many forms and that communication was not limited to sound. The Empire grew wiser because a human had dared to see differently, and a silent princess had shown that understanding could come in new ways. The princess grew older. She became a leader who ruled with wisdom, kindness, and vision. She listened without words, understood without speaking, and led without raising her voice. Her court learned to follow her signals, her movements, and her decisions. She united species that had once struggled to understand each other. Through her silent voice, she built peace, respect, and cooperation across the Empire. The janitor continued his work, unnoticed by most, yet quietly celebrated by those who understood. He had no titles, no medals, no recognition in the formal sense. But in the heart of the princess and the memory of the Empire, he was remembered as the one who changed everything. His simple actions, play, patience, imagination, had unlocked a mind the Empire had once thought unreachable. The princess in turn never forgot him. Every story she told with her puppets, every gesture she made in decision or diplomacy, carried a memory of the human who had seen her differently. He had shown her that connection did not need sound, that understanding did not need rules, and that even the smallest acts of kindness could reach across worlds. As the sun set over the floating gardens, the princess stood on a balcony. She moved her hands gracefully, showing a story of unity, courage, and hope. Across the hall, the janitor watched quietly, smiling. The Empire, vast and proud, had learned a lesson it would never forget. Intelligence is not always spoken, and value is not always recognized at first glance. The silent princess had a voice without sound. The Empire had a new understanding of life, patience, and connection. And the human janitor, unnoticed by most but never by her, had proven that even a small, simple being could make a difference in a universe full of stars. And so the Empire grew stronger, wiser, and kinder. The princess ruled with her silent voice, the janitor continued his humble work, and the lessons of patience, creativity, and human ingenuity spread quietly, like a ripple across the stars. The Empire would remember this forever, not for wealth or power, but for understanding, connection, and the courage to see differently.